Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's noon hour webinar about wild turkeys in Ontario's woodlands, part of the 39th Annual Winter Woodlot Conference. I'm Olivia. I lead the communications for the Ontario Woodlot Association, and I'm just going to get us started with a few housekeeping items before we begin. So as per usual, if you've joined us for a webinar before, all the participants' mics and videos are off, aside from the panelists. We are also recording this webinar so that you're able to view it later, and we'll share it to everyone who's registered for the event. It'll also be available on the OWA's YouTube channel in a couple days. And lastly, at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box. So with what time we have left, you're welcome to put in any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and we will get to them at the end, as many as we can. Now, I'd like to pass things over to Kevin Predin, who's the Vice President of the Model Forest, to start us off and introduce today's speaker.
Yeah. Hi there. Thank you, Olivia. Not only am I the vice president, but I'm also a client. I'm the community forest manager for Dufferin County, and which received its SFI certification in 2025 through the Ontario Model Forest Certification Program. The Model Forest is a not-for-profit charitable organization working with government, landowners, industry, First Nations, non-government organizations, and others to develop new ways to sustain and manage our forests. The Model Forest provides a unique forum where forest owners, managers, and users can create partnerships, share their knowledge, and combine their expertise and resources, which brings us to today's presentation, which is from Matthew Robbins. Matthew is a fish and wildlife biologist who's worked with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, focused primarily on land use policy, migratory birds, and small game species. Raised in the Kawartha Lakes, Matthew is a lifelong conservationist whose work in fisheries and wildlife research has taken him all across Ontario. All right, so please help welcome Matthew to Talk Turkey about wild turkey.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I'm just going to jump right into it then here. Please, somebody let me know if my notes show up as well. Okay. How is that looking?
You're all set to go, Matthew.
All right, no notes?
No notes.
All right, perfect. Well, yeah, thanks again, everyone, for having me. I'm going to talk today about wild turkeys, a bit about the history, a bit about the ecology, and a bit about just management in general, because, of course, this is a Woodlot Association. And so we can jump right in because there is quite a bit to talk about today, and I don't want to keep everybody too long. So just a bit about the history of wild turkeys in Ontario. Turkeys have been historically sort of limited to the Carolinian forests of Ontario. So basically, their range extended to the Precambrian Shield. This has been put as basically being north to Lake Simcoe and eastward between Toronto and Trenton. And they were historically, in pre-colonial times, of course, a very important food source and source of feathers and other resources for Indigenous peoples in Ontario and in North America in general. In fact, interestingly enough, there's evidence for two distinct domestication events by Indigenous peoples in parts of the Americas of wild turkeys. Not in Ontario, to my knowledge, but it's just an interesting little factoid about the valuable role that they played historically. Oops. Am I frozen here? Oh, there we go. As many people will know, turkeys were eventually extirpated from Ontario after European settlement. And the key drivers for this were essentially unregulated hunting, so subsistence hunting, as well as market hunting. Market hunting is exactly what it sounds like. It's hunting wildlife and fishing for fish that go to market. And historically, this is responsible for the decimation of all kinds of species in Ontario. There was also really dramatic habitat change. Obviously, many forests in Ontario. Most of the forests in southern Ontario and central Ontario were cut at one point or another, and for the purposes of agriculture and or for logging. And this made it more difficult for turkeys to survive under the pressure of this high harvest. So basically, by the 1900s, wild turkeys were considered extirpated from Ontario. I believe the last live sighting was somewhere around 1909 in Aurora, and but even in the sort of mid to late 1800s, they were a fairly rare sight. Reintroduction efforts. So there were actually two attempts at reintroduction in Ontario. Basically, initial attempts used pen-raised birds, and they failed because pen-raised birds were just not well adapted to the wild. They were very poor at avoiding predators, for example. They just didn't have survival instincts. And so real successful restoration began when the Wild Turkey Reintroduction Steering Committee was established in the 80s. And the OFH was actually part of that initial committee. It was a partnership between the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and conservation organizations like ours. And ultimately, this group ended up working with a number of U.S. states to transport wild birds through trap and transfer programs. And so basically, in 1984, 22 hens and 5 toms were taken from Missouri and introduced to Norfolk County. Interestingly enough, and I know at this point this is probably common knowledge, but initially bird acquisitions for Ontario from the states were actually a question of trade. So we famously traded moose, river otters, and gray partridge to Michigan, Missouri, and Nebraska and New York, respectively, for our first few hundred birds. And after a lot of introductions, ultimately, by the end of that initial program, about over 4,000 birds had been introduced to more than 275 locations in the province. The OFH, for our part, was heavily involved in this process, from fundraising, on-the-ground volunteering, in releases. And as I already mentioned, we were part of that initial steering committee, and eventually on the group that replaced that steering committee, which is the Ontario Wild Turkey Working Group. And just a neat photo here. We've got one of the releases in the 80s and a more modern photo. This is actually a photo taken by my counterpart, or rather my predecessor in this position with the OFAH. What you see on the ground here is a net that was shot out of a net cannon. This is basically how turkeys are captured in the wild. You can see each of these people who are kneeling are actually kneeling next to a wild bird. So from those 4,400 birds, roughly, that were introduced to Ontario, there's just been resounding success. And while they're generally still associated with oak-dominated forests, deciduous forests, due largely to the influence of forestry and agriculture especially, as well as milder winters, the occupied range of wild turkeys in Ontario has actually grown to be larger than what it was historically. So you can see here on the next slide, there's a comparative map. On the left, we have the historic wild range, or our estimation of it. And on the right, we have the best bet at what the range looks like today. So after that little bit about the history of wild turkeys, we're going to talk turkey biology. Just some basic stuff. Wild turkeys, well, in Ontario, we have eastern wild turkeys. It's a subspecies of turkey. And they're galliforms, which is, it's an order of heavy-bodied terrestrial birds you found throughout the world. They're also known as landfowl. But eastern wild turkeys in particular are the largest bodied subspecies, and they have the largest home ranges on average. They're just generally well adapted to colder climates, things like that. So just as a point of reference, people often look at domestic turkeys in the grocery store, and we're talking 30 plus pound carcasses. Wild birds are obviously going to be a fair bit smaller. So adult hens are typically 8 to 12 pounds ish, and adult toms, which are the adult males, usually are somewhere closer to 15 to 20, but they do occasionally reach all the way up to 30 pounds. This is a very sexually dimorphic species, and what that basically means is that there's a phenotypical distinction between males and females. There's a physical outward manifestation, a visible difference. In this case, it's very obvious. As I mentioned, the males have a larger body mass. Males have a beard. You can see it in the image here, actually. This is just basically a set of modified feathers, and they can grow anywhere from a few inches to 9, even 10 inches long. Males have spurs on their legs like roosters, and they have large snoods and caruncles, which are those dangly things you're seeing on that picture right there, the red bits. Hens do have these, but they're just generally much smaller. Also worth mentioning, turkey lifespans are generally fairly short in the wild. So 1 to 3 years is pretty common. Hens live slightly longer on average, but it does happen that birds can survive well into 8 years, even up to 10 years. This is just sort of an average because there's a high mortality of wild turkeys. A lot of things eat them. It's also worth noting turkeys have an extremely acute sense of sight. Their eyesight is by far their primary predator detection sense. Anyone who has hunted wild turkeys knows this. They are just incredible at picking up little movements. So let's see here. As a basic overview of the sort of life cycle of a wild turkey, basically in the summertime, eggs typically hatch June, July-ish, at least in Ontario's context. And the poults are going to remain with the hens into the fall and winter. In the fall, hens and poults join other hens, and toms form these sort of bachelor groups or flocks. So basically, they form their own flocks or begin the process of forming these flocks separated by sex. And then in the wintertime, I know lots of folks, I'm sure on this call, are going to be familiar with those massive flocks of birds in fields. This is because flocks really concentrate and sometimes relocate to better areas with access to food. And so typically you'll have really large flocks of hens in particular, and also some of these smaller flocks of males as well. And then by the springtime, of course, flocks disperse and breeding begins. This is, I'm sure everyone's familiar with gobbling and the big fanning displays that males go through. And hens will ultimately break up into sort of smaller groups during breeding, and then become solitary when it's time to lay eggs. But we'll talk about that just a little more right here. So turkeys are a polygynous in terms of their mating system. That basically means males attempt to mate with as many females as possible, and they really don't contribute to parental care. Hens, as I already mentioned, during the breeding season, they sort of form these groups a lot of the time. It could be just 2 birds, it could be up to 7 or 8. And during the nesting time, which is a little later in the spring, they become fairly solitary, and they go to a nesting site, often the same site or same general area that they have their entire lives. Now, toms, on the other hand, once spring arrives, they become largely solitary. As I've already mentioned, toms are a mature male turkey. They typically also return to the same general area, home range, year over year, or rather even stay in that same home range. And they really do contribute the majority of the genetic diversity. They contribute to the gene pool because they're doing most of the reproduction with the hens, as opposed to younger males, which are known as jakes. And after wintertime, jakes disperse, but they sort of form a lot of the time. They form these little groups, and they kind of just wander around the landscape like uh, clicky teenagers. It's quite entertaining, but they can sometimes move quite far from their home range, original home range, to find established new breeding territory. As I implied when I was talking about the toms, they don't contribute much to the genetic pool. They very, very, very rarely do any breeding at all because hens just aren't typically susceptible to that. So now we can jump over to wild turkey ecology. In order to get to management, we really have to understand what wild turkeys need, what they rely on. First and foremost, diet is obviously critical to consider. So wild turkeys rely heavily on hard mast crops. These are a key source of fats and just important nutrients for wild turkeys. Really, especially important to help them through the winter time. In Ontario's context, and honestly, generally across most of the eastern range, oaks are the key mast crop for wild turkeys. This can be white oaks. In Ontario's case, it's red oaks by far, but they will also eat, bur oak, acorns as well. Beyond oaks, beech nuts can be really important as well, especially, as I say, to last them through winter and even early spring. But they'll also eat hickory, depending on where you're at, walnuts, witch hazel, hawthorn, even the seeds from flowering dogwood. Soft mast is also pretty important. This is things like raspberries or blackcaps, wild grapes, even spicebush berries. Invertebrates are a critical source of protein for birds. And when I say invertebrates, I'm mostly talking about insects. So insects are absolutely irreplaceable food source for poults. Poults are the young of wild turkeys. They're just critical during their growth stages. But the reason I say invertebrates rather than insects here is because they will, turkeys have been known to peruse, walk up and down streams and ponds and lakes and pick up crayfish and other inverts as well. It's just that the vast majority of what they're going to be eating in terms of invertebrates, I would say, is insects. Really important for the poults, but also a key part of the diet for a lot of adults as well. Herbaceous plants, so they do actually eat a lot of grasses, forbs, things like clover, for example, or milkweed. They're an important part of a turkey's diet. Grains and seeds. So by this I mean ag crops, basically corn and soy. If there's any, I'm sure there's farmers in attendance today, and I won't need to tell them that they eat ag crops a lot. Interestingly enough, wild turkeys will often choose natural food sources over crops when it's available, and so that's actually an interesting point when we're talking about how to maybe mitigate crop damage is really just ensuring you have a healthy forest, and a healthy mast crop can divert some of the attention off of your crops. And then finally, small vertebrates. So the turkeys are true omnivores. They're generalists. They are highly adaptable, and they will absolutely eat a field mouse. They will absolutely eat a frog or a salamander or a snake. If they get the opportunity. They also have been known to at times eat eggs from other birds. So, as I've already mentioned, wild turkeys are considered deciduous forest generalists. They're not specialists. And what that means is that the word mixed is very important. So they typically rely on mixed deciduous with a heavy emphasis on the deciduous forests. But that if a forest is quite mixed and has coniferous trees, it's not going to mean there are going to be no turkeys there. It's just that deciduous trees are obviously a source of mast production that is, and that is obviously very important. They also really need mixed age class with large diameter trees in particular. So again, because they're not a specialist, they benefit from all kinds of, from early successional habitat all the way up to mature hardwood stands to open areas, as we're going to talk about in a minute here. In the case of large diameter trees, these are especially important because, on the one hand, it's a source of food. So again, we keep talking about mast crops, and we're going to keep talking about mast crops. But also, they're a source. They're a location that is typically used by birds for roosting. So roosting is where turkeys sleep. They roost in trees, despite the fact they're these big, gangly critters, and they look very, quite cumbersome, and they're not honestly the best flyers in the world. They do sleep in trees, and typically those are large, tall trees with horizontal or maybe lightly sloping limbs that are found adjacent to some type of an opening or some type of a clearing. And these trees are even used multi-generationally. Typically, if a location, a roosting site is good, it's good for everyone, and it's good to keep an eye on it if you're a hunter, because it will be used likely over and over. So large diameter trees in particular are an important component of turkey habitat for that reason, for food, for cover, for roosting habitat. Open understory. Turkeys are big birds, but they're not really that big as far as wildlife goes. And so they do need a relatively open understory to move around, but not so open that they have no cover. So I have a picture here of a location that I hunt, and you can see in the back there, it is a fairly close canopy forest, but there is still a fair bit of understory. But at the same time, it's absolutely open enough that birds are going to be able to navigate it without any real issue. And unsurprisingly, lots of adult turkeys do go through here. Adjacent to open or semi-open areas. So openings are really important for wild turkeys. And this goes back to this mixed idea. On the one hand, openings provide critical opportunities for foraging, especially for young poults brood during the brooding stage, as we call it. We're going to discuss that in the next slide. But for another thing, these locations provide even mating courtship opportunities. So you'll see toms out, fanned out in openings. The ideal landscape is usually, it's sort of said to be a composition of 50-50 mix forest and open land, but that's not a requirement. In Ontario's case, we've got wild turkey populations that are thriving in areas with much less forest than that. It's just important that there is some opening and there is some forest to a point. And then finally, riparian habitat, riparian zones. So for those who don't know, riparian zones are the vegetative habitat alongside water bodies like rivers, streams, lakes, etc. And they're really critical for all kinds of wildlife because they provide a lot of things. I mean, they're rich in biodiversity. They can be a travel corridor. They're a great foraging opportunity. And in the case of turkeys, they often are good roost locations as well. So despite the fact that they're not necessarily common across the landscape, I mean, they're moderately common, they provide sort of disproportionate benefit. Nesting habitat. The main requirements for wild turkey nesting habitat are really just very basic, because wild turkeys nest on the ground, and this is obviously a vulnerable position to be in for a hen and for eggs. So they're quite simple, but they basically require a backstop and ground cover, ideally with the ability of the hen to poke her head up and sort of look around. So ground cover is usually on the denser side. It will often have a woody components, shrubs, small trees, even like briars, for example. And it's often adjacent to or in close proximity to other positive habitat features, like what we've just been talking about, especially water. On the other hand, it's also very important that a nesting area is dry. It's got dry ground, and this is because poults are not very good at thermal regulation. They can easily become hypothermic, and that ends up being a really significant factor in poult mortality. If a spring is particularly wet and cold, that can cause a high amount of poult mortality. Also worth considering is the proximity to brooding habitat, which we're going to talk about next. And that is the habitat where birds essentially raise their poults after they've been hatched. Just in terms of examples, some of the best locations would be early successional habitats and I would say moderate canopy forests. So despite the fact that we're talking about very dense areas a lot of the time, turkeys will still also nest in these more open areas with their essentially with the nests up against the base of a tree, which is a little counterintuitive, but as long as there's a bit of ground cover and they have that backstop, that's sometimes successful as well. Fields and field edges. This is an important thing to talk about because wild turkeys do nest in fields. They nest in hay fields a lot, and that can obviously be an issue because folks cut their fields, and they cut their fields sometimes early, and this can cause a fairly high level of mortality, or rather a lack of success for nests. So really, the area, the type of habitat is a determinant for the success of a given nest. All right, brood habitat. So this is something that people often don't consider. Brood habitat is a specialized environment where wild turkey hens raise their poults, and it does have some particular requirements. So basically, especially during the first 3 to 4 weeks after hatching, poults require habitat that has good overhead cover. It's sparse at ground level and with ease of movement, and that's really important. They have to be able to be mobile while also covered, and that there's an abundance of insects. As I mentioned earlier, insects are a key source of protein for poults, and in fact, a huge determinant in their development. In some cases, if there's abundant insects available, poults might be flying up to roost in trees as soon as 2 or so weeks old. But if there isn't an abundance of insects, if it's sort of lackluster that way, it could take up to 5 weeks, and that means so much more time on the ground and being vulnerable from a predator perspective. And then finally, dry ground is also an important component for the same reason that I've already mentioned. So many of the best habitats for brood rearing, once again, we've got some weird stuff going on with my slides here. Many of the best habitats are on paper the same as nesting habitats. Again, like fields, hay fields, forest openings, early successional habitat. The key here is really the condition and the age of the location. So to use early successional habitat as an example, during the first 2 years or so after a burn or a cut, vegetation is somewhat sparse, enough to be valuable for brood rearing, basically. After that, after maybe 2 years or so, it tends to become more dense, and that is often a really good habitat for nesting, but not so much for brood rearing. And this applies to other habitat types depending on use, age, and composition. So like grazed pasture may be appropriate for brood rearing if it's only very lightly grazed, but probably not going to be appropriate for nesting because it's not going to be dense enough a lot of the time. So just to give you an example, this is an image of fairly fresh space after a controlled burn. And you can see it's fairly thin on the ground. There's lots of vegetation. You can imagine there's lots of insects here, but it would be navigable for a small bird. Meanwhile, this photo, I would guess, is maybe 2 years after a burn or a cut, and it's getting pretty dense. It's sort of hard to understand the perspective of this photo. I think that it's low enough that it might be valuable for brood, but it's also getting to the point where it's probably next year certainly it's going to be ideal nesting habitat. Constraints. So in terms of the constraints on wild turkeys, I mean, winter severity is a big factor. Depth of snow and crust can prevent birds from being able to get to food. So whether it's crop food or mast crop, that's a big limiting factor. Also, temperatures can restrict birds, and of course, that's one of the reasons that historically their range had been smaller than what it is right now, not as far north. I'm just jumping around here a bit. Predation, so egg predators like crows, skunks, raccoons, and squirrels, basically mesopredators have increased in abundance in Ontario and across a lot of North America. And these really can have a really significant impact on the success of nests in particular, just by eating eggs typically. But also there's predation on adult turkeys as well. So many of these same mesopredators, coyotes, foxes, bobcats, fishers, and interestingly enough, great horned owls are a pretty significant predator of adult turkeys. Food availability is an obvious one, especially in the wintertime, as we've already discussed. Habitat loss / maturation. So as habitat matures, it's not that mature hardwood forests aren't valuable, but if habitat has no early succession, no dense cover or brood rearing habitat, becomes an issue. And then finally, disease. Disease is more of a minor factor. There are some diseases like LPDV or avian pox that can sometimes have habitat level impacts on turkeys, but in the case of something like West Nile virus, it actually doesn't impact them much at all. So it can sometimes have an impact, but I wouldn't put it at the top of the list. So finally, we're to management, which I'm sure many folks are here for. How do you manage your woodlot or your property to be better suited to wild turkeys? And ultimately, turkeys require sort of a mosaic of forest openings and food sources. And so as far as landowners go, there's basically 3 key requirements I feel that you can influence as a landowner and land manager. And those are roosting trees, mass production, and as we've mentioned, nesting and brood cover. Those 2 cover types or habitat types are super critical. So we're going to go through each of these in a little more detail and what you might be able to do as a manager. Roosting trees. The obvious thing here is if you know there's a roosting tree on your property, or trees, plural, retain those, right? But let's say you have a property and you don't know where the roosting is occurring, or you know for a fact it's not happening. Well, it's a good idea where you can to retain tall, large diameter trees that are in proximity to openings, because that is what they're typically looking for. They want trees like the one you see here with horizontal limbs that are pretty tall and have access to a decent landing pad, basically. These can be oaks, they can be black ash, they can be beech trees, elm, maple, even white pines. Even people don't generally think of coniferous trees when it comes to turkeys, but I've seen pine trees as roosting locations. And as you see here, this is an example of one that looks fairly ideal. Basically, they just need that characteristic straight limbs and to be maybe 40, 50 feet in height. Protect southern facing slopes. So in the wintertime, birds, like many wildlife, are strategic about where they position themselves, and south facing slopes tend to get the benefit of sun more for most of the day. So these are areas to focus and look for these large trees. You can also thin or create openings in close proximity to potential roost trees if you've got a closed canopy forest. Again, this is just going to help the trees, the independent trees that seem like possible roost locations, and also going to potentially open up areas so that birds could use them as a roosting location because they have somewhere to fly down. And finally, if you have a younger forest, maybe you don't have a lot of mature trees, obviously you can create conditions that will allow for those trees to thrive. So a big thing is just being cognizant of overcrowding, particularly, once again, for trees that are in close proximity to openings or other important habitat features. And one more area. So this is actually a maple stand that, once again, I hunt. It's the same maple stand from before. And you can see this tree on the right here. It's a setback a little bit, has a bit of horizontal limb going on there. And this is a roosting tree for turkeys. So people maybe don't commonly think of these kinds of trees for roosting, but they do get used. Mast crops. This is huge. We've already discussed it. Acorns in particular are critical for wild turkeys. But, a relatively small percentage of trees produce the majority of the mast in a mast crop. And so, at least in the case of oaks, some trees actually don't even produce acorns at all. These are ideal candidates to cut down for sale, right? And to identify producers, a good strategy is to basically monitor your trees for maybe 3 or so years. And if something isn't producing any acorns or any mast, it's a decent bet that that tree is not going to be a huge producer. That should also give you a decent idea of which trees are producing a lot. And when you find these trees, these sort of legacy trees, you can consider thinning out their competition. They share resources, and with these other trees, often younger trees, sometimes trees that don't produce at all, and opening up the area around them can actually significantly increase their individual production to outpace whatever smaller contributions were being made by less productive trees. It's pretty amazing. And then ultimately, it's important to remember to retain varied age classes of mast-producing trees so that you have natural succession. So hence what we see here is we've got beech nuts on the bottom, we've got witch hazel on the top, and hickory nuts on the right-hand side. And finally, nesting and brood cover. So this is where most of the active management will occur to create sufficient early successional habitat, which is really the best, I think, opportunity for you to create nesting and brood cover. You really need light exposure to a susceptible understory, or rather the ground cover with susceptible seed bank. So I would argue for turkeys, the best way to do this is probably by creating small forest openings and periodically resetting them. So I would say you can choose an area of maybe 1/2 acre to 1.5 acres, ideally in close proximity to roost sites, or food or water, some of these other important features on the landscape, and clear that space of trees. And then clear the floor, the forest floor. So basically, that can be through mulching. You can even do it with a chainsaw. One of the best ways would definitely be through prescribed burns, though, because these really reset the forest landscape and promote regrowth of a lot of native grasses and forbs. So it's best to cut or burn whatever you're doing in more than one location a year or so apart, just to ensure you cover both nesting and brood habitat. And this is because, as we've already discussed, nesting requires dense cover, brood rearing areas require cover with a level of mobility. And in the first year or two after a cut, the ground vegetation will be on the thin side. So again, better for brood rearing. After 2 or so years, it might become denser, and that's nesting habitat. So it's good to have a variety, and creating ultimately a disturbance cycle of maybe 5 to 6 years, where you do this every 5 or 6 years, because at that point, these locations are typically less valuable for brooding and nesting. If you don't want to clear away trees in a full area, like these clearings, you can just apply these same principles to sort of restructure a forest stand. In other words, you can thin a section of woods out, open up the canopy, but not get rid of all of the trees, and again, burn or mulch or cut the understory, and you'll have a similar outcome that can create some decent nesting and rearing habitat. So And for existing small open areas, the same principles really apply. If you can, again, burn or mow or mulch some of these areas and suppress vegetation every 5 or 6 years or so, you can improve the value of these locations for nesting and brood rearing. Beyond that, if we're talking about crop field or hay field in particular, delaying where possible, delaying hay cutting until late June or even July really is really a great idea if it's possible, because that it does account for a lot of failed nests and minimizing livestock grazing in certain areas. Obviously, it's not practical for a lot of people, but if it is possible, if you've got an area that you think is used for brooding in particular, that's a positive thing that you can do. So we're getting pretty close to 40 minutes here, and I'm going to wrap things up. But just a few things to avoid if you can. A lot of these are very standard for all wildlife. So monocultures just generally aren't conducive to healthy habitats and biodiversity, and this applies to ag crops. It applies to silviculture. So tree stands, large amounts of the same tree, especially evenly aged trees, just don't provide that diversity that allow wildlife to thrive, especially generalists. In terms of edges, something to consider when it comes to edges is that a lot of the main predators of turkeys, grouse, etc., they're edge specialists. Coyotes cruise edge lines looking for their next meal. And creating a hard edge that's really consistent can make that easier for them if, say, a bird is nesting just inside the edge. So where possible, soft, more gradual edges can be good. They help with concealment. Fences and hedgerows. So there's a huge trend of removing fences and hedgerows in Ontario and elsewhere right now. And it's really consequential for all kinds of species, including turkeys. These fence rows, they're great for foraging. They're used for nesting. They provide cover and security. When we're talking about creating openings for turkeys, we're not talking about 100-acre openings. We're talking about a few acres. And fence rows, hedgerows, they've historically created this kind of smaller opening in ag country where that sort of security existed. When they're cut down, that's eliminated. Early cutting. When I say cutting, I really mean anything, whether it's cutting hay or significant forest management. It is really important to wait, if you can, until maybe July 1st even or later, just to start really significant habitat alteration activities because of nesting. High grading. Obviously, if you're managing woodlot for financial reasons, high grading is very valuable. You're selecting for high value trees. It's not that you shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't have said avoid high grading, but be selective about it when you do that, and keep in mind what large mature trees are the primary mass producers. What larger trees may be good roost locations, and make your decisions based off that. And then finally, just if you can prevent large scale canopy closure. Again, that's just a question of biodiversity. And when you have these partially open, partially closed canopy systems, you have more early successional habitat, more diversity, better places for nesting and brood rearing for wild turkeys. So a lot of talking. I appreciate everyone for staying on with me, but at this point, I'm happy to take questions and just have a general discussion here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Super. Thanks so much, Matthew. I am now going to share mine. So I'll just put our slides back up here, and I'll encourage folks to continue putting questions in the chat. There are quite a few for us to get to, and we'll get to as many as we can. But please bear with us. All right. Okay, Matthew, are you able to see my slide here?
I
I will
am,
take
yep.
a Excellent. Okay, thank you. All right, and we will. Before we get to the questions, I just want to share as well that we have a small token of appreciation for you. And that is the book How to Love a Forest by Ethan Tapper. He joined the Quinty Woodland Conference last year, and he was also a webinar guest with us in 2024. So we'll be sending that to you after the presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I follow Ethan Tapper, so that's really exciting.
Excellent. Well, hopefully you haven't had a chance to read it yet. Otherwise, we might have to switch to a different book.
No, I have.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start with Q&A and lots of thanks coming in through the chat as well and lots of questions. I've got one here that I'd like to start with about habitat, a couple on the theme of habitat actually. What is the biggest limiting factor to northward expansion, range expansion that is? I have seen them being turkeys in Black River, Matheson, but I'm wondering if they survive the deeper snow, bigger predators, and generally colder environments.
Yeah, great question. The biggest limiting factor, well, it really is probably weather and climate. Certainly, historically, that was the case. So, we had much colder winters on average, and that it has an impact on things like wild turkey and a lot of wildlife actually that are moving north, as we're seeing. Deep snow is a big factor. But beyond that, as I said earlier, range expansion has occurred in part associated with winter trends, but also because of landscape change. So we see a lot of areas that historically didn't have wild turkeys that do now, because there's agriculture and because there's a lot of forestry, which is creating openings. Openings mean early successional habitat, and that means good brooding and rearing habitat and opportunities for foraging, basically ways to supplement their diet if there's perhaps less mast producing trees around. Same with agriculture. It creates these openings, creates food. But if you're hoping for them to expand more northward at this point, unless there's really dramatic landscape changes, probably the thing that's going to inhibit that or determine how it happens is climate and weather. So, as I say, deep snow. We have a very pretty deep snow this year, and it could possibly have some implications for wild turkeys in some areas.
Super. Okay. So related to that, there's a question about sightings of turkeys in northwestern Ontario, particularly the Thunder Bay region. Could you discuss where or how these turkeys may have come to this area?
To be honest, I wasn't aware that there were sightings out in Thunder Bay area. I know that, but okay, so this is interesting. So it's possible that for them to migrate up through, I guess, Minnesota. I'm not sure. Uh, Actually, to be honest with you, I don't think there is a lot in terms of Minnesota. So probably, if I had to bet, and this is just a guess, but there is a type of domestic turkey that looks a lot, and I mean a lot, like a wild turkey. And people will get them because you can buy them. You can buy domestic turkeys, and they'll release them in hopes of establishing a population. But as we discussed earlier, pen-raised birds don't do very well in wild settings. They don't have those instincts, and that would apply to even wild turkeys being raised in pens, but especially for a domestic breed, if you will. So if I had to guess, I would say it's probably that, but I really can't be certain.
Thanks, Matthew. Just on the theme of habitat as well, one person asked whether it would be beneficial for them to create a water source if there currently isn't one on their property.
Yeah, water's, I mean, it's critical for all wildlife. And maybe I didn't dive into that as much as I should have. Typically, good turkey habitat does have some type of water source. That can be, water ponds for cattle. It can be streams. It can be etc. So I would absolutely say yes. If you're looking to make things more ideal and there's no nearby water, that's going to help for turkeys. It's going to help for deer. It's going to help for all kinds of stuff.
Excellent. So good for many types of wildlife. So we have a few questions on predation. There's one question here asking what kind of animals prey on turkeys, and this individual's near North Bay. And there is another question specifically about coyote populations, whether they're linked, and an observation that they often see coyotes hunting turkeys. And we have an abundance of both in the Ottawa Valley area.
Sure. So, in terms of what animals predate on turkeys, if we're talking about adult birds, it's more limited to what I was talking about earlier with nesting. Um, Mesopredators like coyotes, foxes, even raccoons will actually do their best, especially if it's a poult or a larger poult or something like that, a young of the year. Um, Fishers will do it if you're in the northern areas. They'll definitely take a crack at it. As I say, great horned owls are a very interesting source of predation for wild turkeys in a lot of areas. Interestingly enough, they will actually take adult birds out of trees while they're roosting, while they're sleeping. They'll whack them out of the tree. Um, in terms of coyote populations, certainly a lot of people have observed that coyote populations in some areas have increased. And that's actually the case with a lot of mesopredators. I keep going back to raccoons, great example. But there can be, predators can absolutely suppress prey populations. And it's very possible that if you are seeing a suppression, so for example, in the United States right now, in a lot of states, they're actually seeing some declines in turkey populations. That can be all kinds of things and likely is a combination of factors, including the increase of mesopredators on the landscape. But the thing about predation is that it's usually something that can be recovered from pretty quickly. Whereas if we look at habitat, uh, that's a long-term game. If you have a lot of predators in the landscape and they kill a lot of turkeys, but there's still that reproductive population there and it's got the habitat to reproduce, it can bounce back no problem. But if you have no habitat for brood rearing or for nesting, it doesn't matter how many or how few coyotes are around, really. They're just not going to be successful. So it is a factor, and it can, predator management does have its place. I would say especially for nest predators, but it's definitely not the one and only key management strategy.
Got it. Okay. They're moving on from predation. There's been some questions about competition and particularly with ruffed grouse, and some questions about whether there's a correlation between turkeys and ruffed grouse. So there's a question here, do turkeys outcompete ruffed grouse? We've noticed a steep decline in local ruffed grouse population since the arrival of wild turkeys. This would be, I believe, Ottawa area. And then similarly, again, two different areas in Ontario. Apsley and Kearney forested areas 100 miles apart notice decline in ruffed grouse, but turkeys more often. I guess they're seeing turkeys more often. Do you think there's a correlation?
I don't think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they're significant competitors, to be honest. I mean, a lot of the habitat, a lot of the landscape improvements that benefit turkeys benefit ruffed grouse. They both use early successional habitat, but they don't necessarily have all the same food sources. Just in terms of the many things that do impact ruffed grouse populations and do impact turkey populations, I wouldn't put competition as a very high, consideration or concern personally.
Okay, thank you. A question about roosting. So particularly with hens, do the hens roost in trees during nesting?
Right. So the hens will roost in trees once the poults are able to fly up and roost with them. And there's some really interesting pictures out there actually of this. But initially, they're not going to be roosting in trees.
Okay. We're learning so much here today. So there's a few questions about clutches, particularly, I guess, about predation as well. So one question was, will turkeys move their eggs if they feel under threat? And then, somewhat similarly, are turkeys like ducks? If their nests get disturbed or if the eggs get eaten, will they try to re-nest or relay eggs?
Great questions. So, to my knowledge, they don't move their nests if they're under threat. Unfortunately, that's the issue. Really, is that if you accidentally bump a hen off of her nest, it's vulnerable to predators all of a sudden, and she's not going to come back and move it. Uh, but on the other hand, they do renest. It's quite common. It doesn't have the same success rate, unfortunately, but it is an important part of their reproductive cycle because there is a lot of nest failure in wild turkeys, just naturally, even outside of human influence. Um, Predators and weather are really the two big things that can be very high failure rate. So renesting is important.
Okay, thank you. Similar, I guess not similar question, but still along the line of clutches. There was a question here about seeing family groups in the Huronia area, so between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay, in the fall time, and they appear to have two distinct age classes of poults. Is there any evidence of them having multiple clutches during a breeding season?
That's a good question, to be honest with you. I'm just not, I think, familiar enough with if there is research on that. I'm not aware. I think it's more likely that they're traveling with other hens and other younger birds, um, perhaps with another hen that has uh, older poults. So as I say, in the fall time, they generally start to sort of group up with other hens with poults. So it seems to me that that's the most likely explanation, but I just haven't read any research really on that particular query.
Okay, thank you. Um, Getting through here, some of the questions. Those were kind of the ones that I could easily group together, but I have a few questions here that are a little bit distinct from each other. One, just out of curiosity, do you know what might be the maximum length of flight for a turkey?
I really don't, but I have seen them go pretty far. I mean,
That could
to
be
be
a fun
honest with you,
fact.
yes, it could.
I'm sure
I mean,
there's some observations out there.
I have seen them go a good 200 yards. So they,
Wow.
they can go pretty far if they're sort of they flap at first, but then they really do a lot of gliding if it's an open enough space. But the majority of the time when they're flying, they're not going very far at all.
Hmm. Okay. I have a feeling some other hunters could make some interesting
Mm-hmm.
observations on that one. There is, I think we'll take one or two more questions here, just as we're getting close to the hour mark. Someone was noting the second last picture in your slide deck would be a good example, was an example of a turkey field, and they're wondering whether that would be, I guess, a good or a poor example of a turkey field, specifically due to the hard edges there. Any thoughts on that?
That's a good observation. When it comes to hard edges, soft edges, we do have to be realistic. Ideally, soft edges are great for wildlife in general, but it's not necessarily practical all the time in agriculture, especially, right? So we know most fence rows and hedge lines, like the one in that image, uh, there are fairly hard edges, right? Because ag crops come straight up to them a lot of the time. Um, it is, I would still look at that image and say that's a good field because it's got the hedgerow, it's got the fence row, it's got low-lying vegetation and probably great insects. It's got a woodlot in the back, all kinds of great stuff going on. Would it be better with soft edges? Yes, probably. But I wouldn't say that if you see somewhere with the fence line like that, which we all do everywhere, really, it's necessarily a bad thing. It's just that if you can, creating variability is always really good, whether it's the shape of an edge rather than just a straight line, especially across maybe the wood line itself, um, or a softer edge. These are just good things to keep in mind if you can get away with them.
Thanks very much, Matthew. So many questions there. I feel like that was rapid fire for you, and it's much, much appreciated. I think we'll wrap things up now, just as we are getting close to 1 o'clock. And what folks can see here on the screen is a little bit of information about our webinar for next week, part of the Winter Woodlot Conference. There were a few questions that came in about prescribed burns and fires, but I figured that we will leave those questions for next week when we have our Southern Ontario fire expert with us. So about the presentation, it'll be about mitigating and preparing for wildland fire, particularly for woodlot owners. And that's next Wednesday, February 18th at noon. And that link to register is in the chat. And I'll just put up here as well. Our webinar for the following week is about using invasive species such as buckthorn and putting it to good use. But with that, I think we will wrap things up. And thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us today. That was very informative. And thank you to Kevin, Vice President, for connecting us. I think it's safe to say that we all really enjoyed the talk today and learned quite a bit.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll be sharing this on the OWA's YouTube channel.